On the surface of the cold, barren planet, a young alien girl stood alone, gazing up at the vast starry sky. The planet, once teeming with life and civilization, now felt empty and desolate. The wind howled around her, biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. She had been alone for so long that the chill no longer bothered her. Her people, the once great race that had ruled over this galaxy, were now a shadow of their former selves. Her name was Irala, and her world was dying. The resources of her planet were drained, the atmosphere toxic. Her people had fought for survival for generations, but now they were at the brink of extinction. The leaders of her people had sent countless messages to other worlds, hoping for help, but none had answered. Earth, a distant planet she had heard of only in the ancient texts, was a place her people never thought would respond. But today, Irala had one last hope. She had learned of a new technology, a long-range communication, a device that could send a signal far beyond the reaches of their galaxy. If she could only reach the right people, if only her cry could travel far enough, maybe, just maybe, someone would hear it and come to their aid. With trembling hands, Irala activated the device. A low hum filled the air as the signal began to transmit. She didn't know who would hear it, or if anyone would at all. But she couldn't sit idly by while her people withered away. Desperation fueled her every move. She pressed her hands to her chest, her breath catching in her throat, as the message finally sent its last pulse into the cold, dark void of space. "Help us," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We are the last of our kind." As the message shot through space, Irala couldn't help but feel a mix of hope and fear. She had no idea if anyone would receive it, but she had to try. The silence that followed felt deafening. Every second stretched on for an eternity. The wind howled around her, but it felt like nothing more than a distant murmur as she stared at the stars. Irala had never been one to give up easily, but as the hours passed without any response, her heart began to sink. The device, now silent, was her last attempt. She had nothing left to give. Her people were dying, and all she could do was wait. What would happen if no one answered? What would she do if the darkness of space continued to swallow her plea, as it had for so many years? Her thoughts spiraled as the night stretched on. But just as she was about to give up hope, the device came to life again, blinking with a bright, unfamiliar light. Her heart raced as she rushed to the device, her fingers trembling with excitement and fear. The screen flashed with strange symbols and numbers, but then a message appeared. It was in a language she didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. She stared at the screen, wide-eyed. She had no idea what it meant, but she didn't need to. She had been heard. Earth had responded. Irala's breath caught in her throat as she read the message again, her pulse quickening. There was no time to waste. Earth was coming. But what would Earth do once it arrived? Would they truly help? Or had her desperate cry unleashed something far more dangerous? In her mind, the possibilities swelled. The legends she had heard growing up told stories of Earth as a place of unimaginable power. Her people had never truly understood it, but now, Irala feared that the stories may have been more than just legends. Was Earth going to save them, or would they wipe them out, seeing them as just another obstacle in their way? A chill ran down her spine as she thought about the unknowns that lay ahead. The uncertainty was unbearable. She stood there, alone in the cold night, staring up at the stars. The answer to her people's future lay somewhere out there, far beyond what she could comprehend. And as she stared at the signal flickering on the screen, the only thing she knew for sure was this: the universe had just begun to hear the cry for help, and Earth was on its way. The fate of her people would depend on how Earth responded and whether they could survive the fury of what was to come. The message had been sent, but now the wait began. Irala stood alone, staring into the vast emptiness of space. The cold wind whipped around her, but it did little to calm the turmoil within her heart. She had done all she could, now it was up to the stars. The night stretched on, quiet and unbroken, with no response. Irala's thoughts wandered as the hours passed, her mind a whirlwind of hope and doubt. Had the message reached its destination? Was there anyone out there? The galaxy was vast, and her people were so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But what if Earth heard her? What if the legends were true? She closed her eyes, trying to block out the creeping chill in her bones. In her mind's eye she saw Earth, a distant world, so unlike her own, a place where human beings had risen from the dirt to build cities, create empires, and explore the stars. A place filled with endless potential. But was it a place of mercy, or was it something darker? Her hand trembled as she reached for the device again, but before she could touch it, a sound interrupted her thoughts, a soft beep. barely audible, but unmistakable. The device was alive. Her heart leaped in her chest. She rushed over to it, her fingers fumbling as she activated the screen. The symbols were the same as before, but now there was a message she could understand, that it was simple, clear, and chilling. "We are coming." The words stared back at her, their meaning sinking deep into her chest. Earth was on its way. But was it coming as a savior, or as a conqueror? Erola's mind raced. She had heard stories, old tales, passed down through generations, of Earth's terrifying power. Her people had never encountered the humans face to face. But the stories, they spoke of an unstoppable force. A power so vast that it could crush entire fleets without effort, and now, it was coming to her planet. The very force she had hoped would save them might be the one to destroy them. A strange feeling gnawed at her stomach, a sense of both relief and fear. The signal she had sent had worked. They had heard her cry for help. But what would happen next? What if the humans were like the others, only interested in using her people for their own gain? What if they viewed her world as nothing, more than a resource to be harvested, a place to be conquered and taken? For the first time in her life, Erola felt the weight of her decision. The cry for help had been her last hope. She had pushed everything onto this single moment, believing that someone would come to save her people, but she had never considered the consequences of what it might mean if her call was answered by Earth. The wind howled once more, pulling her from her thoughts. She had to prepare. Earth was coming, but she didn't know what to expect. She had heard rumors that humanity was divided, that there were different factions with different motives. Some may come in peace, others in war. Would she be lucky enough to receive help from the ones who cared about justice, or would the war-hungry ones arrive first? She paced back and forth, her thoughts swirling. The people of her planet needed to know what was coming. If Earth's fleet arrived as expected, they would have to be ready. They would have to fight. Her people had no choice but to defend themselves. She pressed a hand to her forehead, exhaustion creeping in, but there was no time for rest. The message had been sent, the response had been received, and now, she was caught in the middle of something far larger than herself, something that would decide the fate of her entire race. The skies above her began to change. The once dark sky was now streaked with a deep red hue, an ominous sign of the storm that was to come. She could feel the weight of it in the air, thick with the promise of impending chaos. Her thoughts shifted to the other planets, the ones that had ignored her people's cries for help for so long. They had turned their backs on her race, unwilling to get involved in a war that wasn't their own. But now Earth had heard her plea, and whether it came in peace or anger, there was no turning back. Her people would never be the same. Erola stared up at the sky, her hands trembling. The message had been received. A fleet was on its way, and with it, the unknown. She had hoped for salvation, but now she wondered if she had made the right choice. Her people were desperate, and in their desperation they had reached out to the one place they had hoped would answer. But what if Earth was not the savior they dreamed of? What if Earth, with all its power, brought nothing but destruction? What if the response to their call was a storm they were not prepared to face? The answer was coming, but it was not yet clear whether it would be salvation or damnation. Erola could only wait. The distant hum of machinery filled the air as Erola stood on the edge of the rocky cliff, staring out at the horizon. The ground beneath her feet vibrated ever so slightly, a reminder that her world was alive with the weight of an impending storm. She had always known that her people's survival would come at a cost, but she never imagined it would be like this. A fleet from Earth was on its way, its presence already sending ripples through her planet's already fragile atmosphere. As she gazed across the barren landscape, her mind wandered to the message she had received earlier. "We are coming." The words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. Earth had heard her cry, but what did that really mean? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Earth's arrival could either be the dawn of a new era for her people or the end of everything they had fought for. She glanced over her shoulder where the rest of her people had gathered. Their faces were etched with fear, uncertainty clouding their eyes. There had been no time to prepare for what was coming. The technology she had used to send the message had been their last hope, but she hadn't anticipated the response to be so overwhelming. And now, Earth was on its way, with its massive fleet and untold power. A soft breeze tugged at her hair as she turned back to face the sky. The stars were beginning to fade, replaced by the dark silhouettes of the ships in the distance. They were approaching, slowly but surely. Erola could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Her people had no idea how to fight back against such an immense force. In the distance, she saw the first signs of movement. Small, dark shapes, appeared on the horizon, dotting the sky like distant stars. The ships were getting closer. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with each passing moment. Her heart raced, and she swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. This was not a situation she could control. Her thoughts raced as she watched the ships grow larger in the sky. Why were they coming? Was Earth truly coming to help? Or was this an invasion and attack? She had always heard of Earth's power, of its strength and dominance. But now that it was here, she didn't know if that strength was something to fear, or something to trust. As the ships drew closer, Arola could see the dark, imposing shapes of the fleet. Each one seemed to loom larger, casting an eerie shadow across the land. The scale of it was beyond anything she had ever seen. Her planet, small and forgotten in the grand scheme of the universe, had never known this kind of power. The fear in her people's eyes was palpable as they stared up at the approaching ships. The question on everyone's mind was the same: what happens next? The wind howled louder as the fleet descended, its massive shadow swallowing up the light. Ara could hear the muffled voices of her people behind her, their whispers filled with dread. She turned to face them, trying to find the words to calm their nerves, but they all seemed inadequate. How could she comfort them when she was just as terrified as they were? The ships were nearly overhead now, their engines roaring in a way that shook the very ground beneath her. She could feel the vibrations in her chest as they passed overhead, their massive size almost too much to comprehend. The air seemed to ripple with energy, crackling with tension. She had no idea what the humans wanted, but one thing was clear: they were not here to negotiate. She looked up again, searching the skies for any sign of communication, some indication of Earth's intentions, but there was nothing. The ships continued their descent, and Arola knew that soon they would land. With every passing second, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Earth was here, and they weren't here to offer salvation. The sheer force of their arrival spoke volumes. Her people had been warned, had been told that Earth's power was unlike anything they had ever seen. But nothing could prepare them for the overwhelming presence of the fleet. The first ship landed, with a thunderous crash, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Arola flinched, shielding her eyes from the blinding cloud of dirt. She heard the others around her gasp, their fear growing with every passing moment, but she couldn't move. She couldn't look away. The massive doors of the ship slowly creaked open, and Arola's heart pounded in her chest. The moment they had all feared had arrived. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. At first it was hard to make out, shrouded in the thick dust and smoke that surrounded the ship. But as the dust began to settle, the figure became clear. A human. A breath caught in her throat. The human was tall, wearing a dark, sleek suit that shimmered in the dim light. Their face was hidden behind a helmet, but the stance, the posture, everything about them radiated power. They were here to command, to take control. The human stood there for a moment, surveying the scene. Arola felt a chill run down her spine. As the figure's gaze seemed to lock onto her, it was as though they were sizing her up, assessing her as though she was nothing more than an obstacle. Her heart raced. What was happening? Why had Earth sent this force to her world? And most importantly, what did they want from her people? The moment seemed to stretch on forever. But just as Arola was about to speak, the human raised their hand, signaling for the others to move forward. More figures emerged from the ship, each one just as imposing, just as frightening. The question was no longer whether Earth had come to help. It was whether they had come to conquer. The ground shook beneath Arela's feet as the human fleet continued to descend, their ships now filling the sky, blocking out the stars. She watched as more figures emerged from the massive vessels, their movements precise and calculated, a force to be reckoned with. The humans didn't speak. They simply moved forward, their boots making a chilling sound as they hit the cracked, frozen surface of her world. Arela's pulse quickened, and she found herself frozen, unable to tear her gaze away from the advancing army. The scene around her felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. This wasn't what she had imagined when she first sent the message. This wasn't salvation. The humans spread out, forming a perimeter around her people. Arola could see their eyes now, behind the helmets, cold and calculating. They didn't look like soldiers, they looked like hunters. Her stomach twisted with fear. This was the price of hope. What she had so desperately begged for was now here, and it wasn't the help she had prayed for. Behind her, the alien survivors watched in stunned silence. Fear hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. There was no war cry, no rallying shout. Her people were too scared, too outmatched, to even think of fighting back. The alien resistance they had once dreamed of was nothing but a distant memory. Earth had come, and with it, a power so overwhelming that resistance was no longer an option. Arila's eyes flicked from the humans to her people, whose faces were filled with terror. They had never seen anything like this anima so strong, so confident. The question echoed in her mind. What were they here for? Was Earth here to annihilate them, or was there a glimmer of hope in this monstrous response? As the first human approached, Arola felt a chill settle deep within her. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She had never known such power, such a force that could not be ignored. The human stopped just a few feet from her, staring down at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Was it pity or something darker? "I am Captain Riker," the human said, his voice cool and detached, cutting through the silence like a blade. The sound of his voice sent a ripple through the crowd. "We've come to make sure you understand the consequences of asking for help." Arila's heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't help. It wasn't mercy. It was a warning. Earth hadn't come to save them. They had come to assert their power, to make an example out of her people. The realization crashed over her, and she nearly collapsed under the weight of it. The Earth that she had once hoped would bring salvation now stood as the very thing she had feared, an unstoppable force that had no intention of showing mercy. Captain Riker continued, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've made a grave mistake. By calling us, you've shown weakness. And weakness, in our world, is punished." Arila's breath caught in her throat. The pain in her chest was unbearable as she tried to process what was happening. Her people had never been weak. They had fought for survival, scraped by through the hardest of times. But now, in the face of such overwhelming power, everything they had built seemed like nothing more than a flickering ember waiting to be snuffed out. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead with them, to ask for mercy, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? How could she convince a force like this that her people were worth saving, that they had something to offer beyond their desperation? Before she could find her voice, Riker raised his hand, and the tension in the air thickened even more. His soldiers moved forward, fanning out as they began to take control of the area. Arila's people were corralled, separated, and subdued without a word of resistance. They were too frightened to do anything but comply. The realization that her people were completely powerless sank in. Arila's heart pounded in her chest, and a sense of helplessness washed over her. They had nothing left. No weapons, no defenses, no allies. The humans didn't need to fight them, they could simply take everything. The thought made her sick to her stomach. The human soldiers began to set up equipment, their actions methodical, efficient. Each movement was calculated, as though they had done this 1,000 times before. As they worked, Riker remained standing in front of Arola, his gaze never wavering from her. "You made a mistake, alien," Riker said softly, but the words were sharp, each one laced with venom. "You thought you could call for help from a place like Earth, but you've learned nothing. You're nothing but a blip on the radar, and now you'll suffer the consequences." Arola could barely breathe as she stared at the human before her. She had done it. She had sent out the cry for help, and it had been answered. But it hadn't been answered with mercy or kindness. It had been answered with force, with power, with the cold indifference of a superior civilization that viewed her people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the truth. This was it. There was no turning back. Her people were at the mercy of a force far greater than anything they could ever hope to overcome. They were at the mercy of Earth. She took a deep breath, the weight of the situation crashing down on her, and a single thought pierced her mind. Could they survive this? The first of the human soldiers turned and began to move toward the center of the camp, but Arila's gaze remained fixed on Captain Riker. His cold eyes met hers, and she knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of something far more terrible than she could ever have imagined. The storm had only just begun. The air was thick with tension as Arola watched Earth's forces set up their control center in the heart of her world. The ships that had descended, each a towering symbol of power, now formed a ring around the alien settlement. Their dark, metallic frames glinted in the dim light of the dying day, casting long shadows that stretched over the landscape like a cloak of doom. The humans, with their cold precision and unwavering confidence, moved about their business, indifferent to the fear that hung heavily in the air. Arila's heart thudded in her chest as she stood in the midst of her people. They had been stripped of their weapons, their pride, and now their hopes. The humans had taken everything without a fight, without any resistance at all. Every movement the humans made was deliberate, designed to remind her people of their helplessness, of their utter inability to stand against this unstoppable force. There was no escape from it, no place to hide. As she watched them work, her mind raced. She had called for help. She had sent the message, pleading for mercy, for salvation. But the response was not what she expected. Earth had not come to lift her people from the brink of extinction. No, Earth had come to dominate, to remind them of their place in the universe. The reality of her mistake was crushing, suffocating. What had she done? The humans were efficient in their work, setting up communication towers and deploying machinery to monitor and control the area. Their technology was far beyond anything Arela's people had ever known. The lights from their equipment flickered in the gathering darkness, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. They moved like shadows, their actions calculated, and Arola couldn't help but feel small, insignificant under their watchful eyes. One of the soldiers, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, walked toward her. His footsteps echoed in the quiet, a sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. He didn't speak as he stopped in front of her, but his gaze was hard, unyielding. Arola stood still, her breath shallow, unwilling to show fear. But inside, she was trembling. What did he want? Was this the beginning of their punishment? Would they be eradicated one by one? You're in no position to bargain. The soldier finally spoke, his voice low and firm. You called us here. You made your choice. Now, we do what's necessary. Arola swallowed, her throat dry. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? What was left to say when everything she had hoped for had turned to dust? She had hoped Earth would come to her people's aid. She had thought that if they just sent a message, if they reached out to a higher power, help would arrive. But now, that help had become the very thing her people feared the most. The soldier's eyes never wavered from hers as he took a step closer. He looked down at her as if measuring her worth in that single moment. The silence between them stretched, long, each second dragging like an eternity. Arela's thoughts were scattered, each one racing faster than the last. She felt trapped, stuck in a situation with no way out, no way to change what had been set in motion. We will take control of your planet, the soldier continued, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. This world, your people, everything, you will be subjugated, you will serve. The words hit Arola like a physical blow. Serve, it was a word her people had never known. They had always been free, always fought to remain independent, to stand tall in the face of adversity. To hear it now, coming from this human, felt like a betrayal. It was as if she had unknowingly opened the door to her people's doom, inviting an invasion that could never be undone. But even as the weight of his words settled over her, something stirred inside Arola. She wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't let this be the end. Her people were too proud, too strong to simply lie down and accept defeat. There had to be a way out, a way to fight back. She had seen the strength of humanity, but she had also seen their flaws. They were not invincible. They were not gods. Why? Arola finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, why destroy us? Why not help us? The soldier's expression remained unchanged, his eyes cold and unfeeling. You're weak, he said simply. Your world is nothing but a resource, and you, your people, are nothing but obstacles standing in the way of progress. We came here not to save you, but to take what we need and erase what stands in our way. It's the way of the universe. The words stung, each one more painful than the last. Earth had come to conquer, not to save. Her people, once proud and powerful, were now nothing more than a stepping stone for a stronger, more ruthless race. But Arula refused to let despair consume her. If Earth thought they could take her world without a fight, they were gravely mistaken. Eyes flickered to her people, who were being herded into makeshift camps by the human soldiers. Their faces were full of fear, but there was still a flicker of defiance in their eyes. They might not have the strength to fight back now, but Arula knew something they didn't. Their spirit was far from broken. She would not let her people fall without a fight. No matter how small, no matter how impossible, she would find a way to push back. The soldier turned and began to walk away, leaving her standing in the cold. But Arula's mind was already racing. There had to be a weakness, a crack in the armor of this earthly force. She didn't know what it was yet, but she would find it. She would lead her people. She would not let them be erased. Thus the soldier disappeared into the growing shadows of the camp. Arula's resolve hardened. The fate of her people rested in her hands now, and she would not let Earth's hellish fury be the end of them. This was far from over. The days blurred together as Arula watched her world change before her eyes. The human forces had made themselves at home on her planet, erecting towering structures in the once pristine landscapes, their machines humbling everything around them. Every corner of the settlement had been transformed into a military stronghold. The alien civilians, once free, were now confined to camps, forced to endure the relentless grip of Earth's soldiers. It was a nightmare that she couldn't wake from, but as the humans tightened their hold, something else stirred within Arola. The humiliation and the pain were unbearable. Yes, but beneath it all, there was a flicker of something else, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Arola had been desperate before, but now she was angry, furious. She couldn't let her people live in fear. They had a legacy, a proud history that Earth didn't understand. They had fought for their freedom, and they could fight again, but it would take more than just hope. It would take action. She paced restlessly through the camp, her mind racing with plans and ideas. The humans had brought their advanced technology with them, but they had also brought their arrogance. They underestimated her people, assuming that because they had the strength to invade, they had already won. But Earth had made one fatal mistake. They had forgotten the strength of the alien spirit. The heart of her people was something that no technology could control, no army could crush. Arila's eyes swept over the camp. She knew the soldiers were always watching, always keeping an eye on them, but that didn't stop her. Every day the humans paraded their strength, flaunting their superiority in every action they took. But Arila could feel it. There were cracks. In the armor, the humans might have the numbers, but her people had something they didn't: determination. She could see it in their eyes, the same glimmer of defiance she had seen in her own when she had first sent out the call for help. The soldiers moved in predictable patterns, their every step measured, their every action precise. It was almost too easy to predict what they would do next. The humans relied on control, on order, on their overwhelming power to keep her people in line. But it was that very control that Arola could use to her advantage. She just needed to figure out how. Her fingers drummed against her thigh as she walked, thinking. The soldiers always took the same route, patrolling the perimeter of the camp, ensuring that nothing escaped. They had a routine, a pattern that could be exploited. It was like clockwork, predictable, reliable, and dangerously easy to disrupt. But she would need help. She couldn't do this alone. Arola stopped and turned to face the group of survivors, huddled together near the center of the camp. They were the last of her people, the few who hadn't been taken or crushed under Earth's weight. They were broken, yes, but they were still alive, and that meant they still had a chance. Her heart pounded with determination as she stepped toward them. She had to rally them. It was time to awaken the warrior spirit that Earth had forgotten. "We can't live like this," Arola said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We're not animals to be caged. We are more than this. We have to fight back. Earth may think they've won, but they haven't seen the strength of our will, and that will be their downfall." The group fell silent, their eyes meeting hers. Some of them had lost everything: family, homes, their very identity. Others were too afraid to speak, too terrified to even consider the possibility of rebellion. They had all seen what Earth's soldiers were capable of, and the fear was deeply rooted. But there was something in Arila's voice, something that stirred the embers of defiance in their hearts. She could see it in their eyes, the first flickers of hope, the first spark of determination. "Arila, how?" one of the survivors asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "How can we fight them? They have everything, we have nothing. We have each other," Arola replied firmly, "and we have the knowledge of our world. We know this planet, its terrain, its weaknesses. The humans don't. We can use that. We can disrupt their systems. We can strike when they least expect it." A murmur of agreement passed through the group, but the doubt remained. Could they really do it? Could they stand against the might of Earth's military force? Arola knew that the odds were slim, but she also knew one thing her people had: nothing left to lose. If they didn't fight, they would die in silence, slaves to an enemy that had no understanding of them. And that, to Arola, was a fate far worse than death. "We don't need to defeat them in one strike," Arola continued. "We need to weaken them, confuse them, make them question their control. If we can disrupt their communications, their supply lines, anything that makes them feel the uncertainty of being vulnerable, they'll start to falter. We don't need to win everything at once. We need to take back what we can." The group fell quiet again, processing her words. Arola could see the wheels turning in their minds, the gears of resistance slowly starting to move. She could almost feel the shift in the air, the change from fear to determination. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "We'll do it together," Arola said. "We've fought worse. We've survived worse, and now we fight back." One by one, the survivors began to nod, a quiet resolve building among them. They were ready to fight. Arola could feel the tension in the air shift. The spark of rebellion had been lit, and she would stoke it until it became an inferno. They would show Earth what it meant to underestimate the will of a people fighting for their survival. This was far from over. The battle for their world had just begun. The first wave of resistance was quiet, a mere whisper of defiance in the grand scheme of Earth's overwhelming power. But to Irola and her people, it was a spark, an undeniable signal that they could still fight back. They had struck the humans' communication network with precision, disrupting their transmissions long enough to send a ripple of uncertainty through their ranks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a message. We're not finished yet. Irola stood on the edge of a craggy ridge, overlooking the sprawling human encampment below. The smoke from their machinery rose into the sky, mixing with the ash of her burning world. The once vibrant landscape was now a dull, lifeless gray, stripped of its beauty and purpose. But even here, in the shadow of human dominance, Irola could feel the fire inside her people growing. They had started to believe again, and that belief was a force no army could suppress. Her fingers tightened around the makeshift weapon she had crafted, a crude, but functional tool built from the remnants of human tech and her people's ingenuity. They had learned to adapt, to fight with what they had. The humans had their advanced ships, their powerful weapons, but her people had something they couldn't replicate: the will to survive. The small group of survivors had become a tight unit, moving with purpose as they sabotaged human equipment, broke through supply lines, and caused as much chaos as possible within their limited reach. Each success, no matter how small, was a victory. Irola had begun to see the transformation in her people. Where once there had been fear and resignation, there was now determination, a refusal to be erased. Irola knew that they couldn't keep this up forever. The humans were organized, methodical, their power was unmatched. But the one thing that humans didn't understand was that her people would never stop fighting. Even when there seemed to be no hope, even when it looked like all was lost, they would continue to rise. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling in the underbrush. Behind her, she didn't flinch. She didn't need to look to know it was one of her own. The resistance had grown, more survivors trickling in from hidden pockets of her world, all of them driven by the same cause: to take back what was rightfully theirs. Irola, a familiar voice, called softly. She turned to see Yarek, one of the first to join her in the fight, stepping into view. His face was covered in dirt and exhaustion, but his eyes were filled with that same fire. "We've got word from the others. The humans are starting to panic. They're not sure who's attacking them, but their communications are getting worse. They're starting to feel the pressure." Irola nodded, her heart quickening. It was happening. The disruption was taking hold. The humans were beginning to doubt their own control. The cracks were starting to show, and this time, her people would exploit them. "I'll gather the others," Yarek continued. "We've been preparing for this. If we move now, we can hit their command center while they're still disoriented. They're vulnerable." The plan was riskier than anything they had attempted before. But Irola knew this was their chance. If they struck at the heart of the human operation, they might be able to force a change, shift the balance of power, even if only for a moment. A moment could be enough. "We need to be swift," Irola said, her voice steady, despite the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "We hit them hard, hit them fast, and we get out before they can retaliate. We may not have much time." Yarek nodded. "I'll coordinate the others. We're ready." Irola stood for a moment longer, taking in the sight of the human camp. Below it loomed large, dark, and impenetrable, but she could see beyond the metal and the machinery. She could see the cracks. The resistance was working. The humans were slipping, and for the first time since their arrival, she felt the smallest glimmer of hope as Irola moved to join the others. The wind picked up, sweeping across the ridge and biting at her skin. The wind carried the smell of her world, burning, desolate, but still alive. Her people had endured far worse, and they would continue to endure. They would fight for their home, for their future. The resistance had become more than just an act of survival. It had become a statement. They were not animals to be hunted, not insects to be exterminated. They were a people, a civilization, and they would not go quietly into the night. The team was ready, and Irola could feel their resolve. They had done the impossible before. They had struck at the heart of Earth's technology, taken down their most sophisticated systems, and survived. The humans thought they had the upper hand, but Irola knew better. It was the underdog who often won the hardest battles, and her people, battered and broken as they were anything but defeated. The time for hesitation was over. Irola looked at the faces of her comrades, each one of them ready to do whatever it took to reclaim their world. This was their last chance, and they weren't about to let it slip away. With a deep breath, Irola raised her hand to signal the start of the assault. The quiet tension that had hung over the group for days snapped, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. They moved as one, with a quiet ferocity, slipping through the shadows toward the human command center. The humans might have thought they were in control, but they were wrong. This world, this people, they were not going to fall. Not today, not ever. The battle had begun, and with it, the beginning of Earth's reckoning.